Imagine stupidity as more than just a lack of intelligence. Imagine it as a hidden force capable of turning brilliant minds into tools of destruction. Perhaps the biggest danger to society isn't malicious people doing malicious things, but ordinary people who have simply stopped questioning. Consider this. An accomplished scientist with an impressive academic record begins spreading dangerous falsehoods. A kind teacher starts defending harmful belief systems. A devoted parent begins making choices that put their own children at risk. None of these people are villains. They are thoughtful, well-intentioned individuals who have fallen prey to what the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer described as the danger of stupidity. And the unsettling part is that this isn't something that only happens to other people. It can happen to any of us. This isn't merely an abstract idea. Back in 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram ran his now famous obedience study at Yale. Everyday volunteers, directed by someone in a position of authority, were told to give what they believed were escalating electric shocks to another participant. Even as they heard cries of pain, nearly 2/3 of them continued administering shocks they thought might be fatal. These weren't cruel or disturbed individuals. They were ordinary people who had, for a time, given up their own moral judgment. This mirrors precisely what Bonhoeffer observed in Nazi Germany, an experience that shaped one of his most disturbing theories about human behavior. Before going further, consider this. Have you ever adopted a belief simply because those around you held it too? Hold on to that thought as we look at one of the more significant psychological insights of our time. Bonhoeffer was no detached academic theorizing from a distance. He was a German Lutheran minister who lived through the transformation of his entire nation. Born in 1906 to an intellectual household, his father was a well-known psychiatrist. Bonhoeffer had every reason to trust in education and reasoned discussion. Yet as the Nazis gained power, he witnessed something that undermined his confidence in human reason altogether. He saw fellow Germans, cultured, educated, religious people, throw their support behind leaders and policies that ran counter to their own stated values. These weren't uneducated crowds being deceived by propaganda alone. They were academics, physicians, clergy, and intellectuals actively giving up their own capacity for independent thought. Writing from prison in 1943, awaiting execution for his part in a plot against Hitler, Bonhoeffer captured this in one of his most chilling reflections. That stupidity convinces itself it is virtuous, which makes it nearly impossible to correct. One of Bonhoeffer's sharpest observations concerned how this kind of stupidity props up existing systems of power. A person who knowingly does wrong experiences inner conflict that can eventually undo them. But someone gripped by this functional stupidity believes they're acting rightly, and that conviction makes them almost impervious to reason. This isn't coincidental. Those holding power no longer need to hide the truth outright. They simply need to build conditions where honestly engaging with information becomes exhausting or impractical. Bonhoeffer wasn't referring to low intelligence or poor education when he spoke of stupidity. He meant something more nuanced, a kind of chosen or functional ignorance. In his prison writings, he noted that although a stupid person may seem stubborn, that stubbornness shouldn't be mistaken for independence. Talking with such a person, he said, feels less like engaging another human being and more like confronting the slogans and catchphrases that have taken hold of them. What made his theory groundbreaking was the claim that stupidity often isn't a personal failing at all. It can arise from systemic pressures that make independent thought both difficult and costly. Our economic systems, in fact, reward mental shortcuts. Social media companies profit when people react emotionally instead of thinking things through. News outlets thrive on outrage rather than nuance. Politicians succeed with catchy slogans instead of thoughtful policy. When people are juggling multiple jobs, buried in debt, and overwhelmed with information, giving up on careful thinking can become a coping mechanism. This is what economists call rational ignorance when staying uninformed is, in practical terms, more efficient than the effort required for real understanding. But what's rational for the individual can be disastrous for society as a whole, the very pattern Bonhoeffer saw unfold in Germany. This isn't just about personal choice. It reflects structural pressure pushing people toward giving up independent thought, and our overstressed brains are all too ready to comply. Beyond economic pressures, our brains themselves are built to conform. In the 1950s, Leon Festinger's research into cognitive dissonance revealed the mechanics behind this. When we encounter facts that clash with our existing beliefs, our minds instinctively resist them. Bonhoeffer intuited something psychology later confirmed. This resistance intensifies under stress, exhaustion, or financial insecurity conditions modern life produces in abundance. He also noted that stupidity tends to surface in groups, observing that it functions less as a psychological issue and more as a social one. He recognized that even rational people could lose their critical faculties once absorbed into a crowd or movement, and insight well ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's 1950s conformity studies later confirmed exactly what Bonhoeffer had already sensed. When placed in a group that gave obviously incorrect answers, roughly 3 out of 4 participants went along with the mistake at least once, despite knowing better. Now picture how this unfolds online. Social media algorithms build echo chambers that make this kind of conformity even easier to fall into. A 2018 MIT study found that false claims travel about 6 times faster than accurate ones across social platforms, largely because misinformation tends to feel more emotionally satisfying than complicated truths. When people share content that confirms what they already believe, they're feeding a system that rewards quick reactions over careful thought. The algorithm responds by serving up more of the same, trapping users in a kind of intellectual quicksand. Ever notice how your feed seems to show exactly what you want to see? That's no accident. It's ignorance by design. History offers plenty of examples of this dynamic. The Salem witch trials weren't orchestrated by evil people, but by devout community members convinced they were protecting their neighbors. The 1950s Red Scare wasn't driven by malice either, but by patriotic citizens who genuinely believed they were safeguarding their country. In both cases, educated, intelligent people set aside critical thinking in favor of group consensus and emotional conviction. So if both our biology and our social systems work against us, how do we push back? Bonhoeffer believed that overcoming stupidity demands what he called costly grace, the courage to think independently even when doing so is uncomfortable, unpopular, or risky. Today, though, we're not just up against social pressure, we're up against evolutionary instincts and algorithms engineered to exploit them. On a personal level, cultivating intellectual humility, recognizing that our understanding is always partial and possibly flawed, can help. That means deliberately exposing ourselves to opposing viewpoints, not as self-punishment, but as a genuine test of whether our beliefs hold up. A few practical habits can help build this kind of resistance. First, seek out intellectual friction. Regularly read well-reasoned arguments from people who disagree with you, not necessarily to change your mind, but to see if your views can withstand scrutiny. Second, practice what might be called productive doubt. When you feel completely certain about something, ask yourself what evidence would actually change your mind. If nothing comes to mind, that's worth noticing. Third, pause before sharing. Taking even a minute to verify something from an independent source before posting can interrupt the emotional momentum that algorithms depend on. And finally, get comfortable saying, "I don't know," when that's genuinely the truth. In a culture that rewards confident wrongness over honest uncertainty, admitting the limits of your knowledge is a quietly radical act. Still, personal habits alone won't solve this. We also need broader changes that make honest thinking easier to sustain, requiring platforms to be transparent about how their algorithms shape what we see, funding real media literacy education, and designing digital spaces that reward open-mindedness rather than tribal loyalty. Just as important, addressing the economic stress that leaves people mentally depleted would free up the bandwidth needed for careful, thoughtful engagement with complex issues. Bonhoeffer's insight was ahead of its time, but he couldn't have predicted just how far this dynamic would evolve. Modern neuroscience shows that our brains are, in a very real sense, built to fall into these patterns. He witnessed propaganda delivered through newspapers and radio. We're now facing something far more sophisticated: algorithms fine-tuned to our psychological triggers, and AI-generated content capable of manufacturing entirely false realities. The danger isn't just growing, it's aimed directly at the mechanics of human thought itself. This goes beyond history or politics. It's rooted in how our brains function. We evolved to favor speed over accuracy, to trust the familiar over the unfamiliar, and to seek out information that confirms existing beliefs. These traits once helped our ancestors survive split-second decisions. The unsettling truth is that none of us are immune, regardless of how sharp we believe ourselves to be. Just as Bonhoeffer described, when people feel anxious or uncertain, they become more drawn to confident-sounding explanations that simplify complexity. And here's the part that makes his warning feel even more urgent now. We're no longer only contending with human persuasion. We're up against systems built by artificial intelligence, precisely engineered to target our cognitive weak points. Every click, hesitation, and emotional response is tracked and used to undermine our ability to think for ourselves. This became strikingly visible during the COVID-19 pandemic, when doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with strong analytical training, began circulating debunked claims about vaccines and treatments. This wasn't a failure of intelligence, but of intellectual independence under extraordinary strain. Bonhoeffer paid the highest price for holding on to his own independent thinking. He was hanged on the 9th of April, 1945, mere weeks before the war ended. A fellow prisoner recalled his final words, that this was the end for him, but the beginning of true life. His death wasn't only an act of political resistance, it was a defense of humanity's capacity for thought itself. He believed that once people stop thinking for themselves, they lose something essential to being human, becoming, as he put it, puppets controlled by whichever force is strongest at the time. That's what makes his challenge feel so relevant today. When conformity feels inevitable, when independent thought demands real courage, when telling the truth costs more than comfortable lies, who holds their ground? The answer has little to do with intelligence or credentials. It comes down to a daily decision, to stay curious instead of certain, to pursue truth over comfort, to think things through rather than react on impulse. These aren't grand heroic gestures, they're everyday habits that become remarkable simply because so few people still practice them. The trouble is that giving up on independent thought often feels like relief. Thinking is genuinely hard. Holding conflicting, complicated ideas in your mind at once is uncomfortable, and admitting you might be wrong about something that matters is painful, but Bonhoeffer believed that discomfort is simply the cost of staying fully human. In a world that profits from our willingness to stop thinking, choosing to think anyway becomes an act of quiet defiance, which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. None of us are exempt from this kind of stupidity. The instant we assume we're above it, we've already started slipping. Real intellectual freedom demands constant vigilance, not against outside threats, but against our own inclination to stop thinking when it gets hard. Bonhoeffer's theory remains unsettling because it holds up so well under scrutiny. We see its fingerprints everywhere: smart people embracing clearly false ideas, educated individuals making terrible decisions, well-meaning citizens backing policies that contradict their own values. The issue isn't declining intelligence, it's that our systems increasingly reward shortcuts over genuine thought. Still, there's real hope buried in this diagnosis. If stupidity is partly a choice, it can be unchosen. If it's shaped by structures, those structures can be reformed. If it stems from mental overload, we can design conditions that make thinking easier rather than harder. Think of critical thinking the way you'd think of physical fitness: uncomfortable at first, but necessary for strength. Just as no one runs a marathon without training, no one navigates today's flood of information without practicing intellectual discipline. Like muscles, our capacity for independent thought weakens without regular use. The next time you feel absolutely certain about something, the next time you brush off evidence that challenges you, the next time you enjoy the comfort of having it all figured out, remember Bonhoeffer's warning. Functional stupidity rarely announces itself. It simply whispers that you already know all you need to know. That moment of recognition is a choice point. Will you settle for the comfort of certainty, or choose the harder road of thinking for yourself? Bonhoeffer's real challenge isn't about intelligence, it's about whether we're willing to keep thinking even when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. In a world built to profit from our surrender, choosing to think carefully is one of the most meaningful things we can do. Here's a challenge. This week, pick a belief you hold firmly and spend half an hour researching the strongest counterarguments. Not to shake your confidence for its own sake, but to practice the kind of intellectual courage Bonhoeffer gave his life for. If your belief holds up, you'll trust it more. If it doesn't, you'll have learned something valuable about the difference between conviction and truth. The future of human dignity may well hinge on how we respond to this challenge. If this has made you reconsider something you once took for granted, that's not a weakness. It's the start of intellectual courage. Share it with someone unafraid to think deeply, even when it's uncomfortable, because in a world designed to profit from our surrender, Careful thought is the most powerful form of resistance we have. Remember this: every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, and careful reasoning over knee-jerk reaction, you're protecting more than your own mind. You're defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age shaped by artificial stupidity. So, what belief are you willing to question this week? Share your thoughts, and let's commit together to standing firm in our thinking, even when everyone else has stopped.